will coincide with Valentine's Day, the International Day of Love. The history of Valentine's Day originated back to ancient Rome, like all good things, where it was a 2-day festival of vitality, promoting fertility and the pairing of young men and women. It later on got recognized by Saint Valentine, a martyr, who ceremoniously married off young couples, which was outlawed during the time of Emperor Claudius, in which he banned marriage because he felt like male soldiers would perform better if they had no commitments. So, in secrecy, Saint Valentine would perform ceremonies. Um, and then into the Middle Ages, in which we saw the exchanging of handwritten notes, gifts, and poetry. And then some 400 years later, it is now the global celebration marked by the exchanging of gifts. My guest today is Dr. Lauren Breen, a community psychologist and a professor of psychology at Curtin, a researcher, academic, and a thanatologist. If you're like me and you don't know what a thanatologist is, well, it's the expert in the study of death, dying, grief, and bereavement. So please welcome Dr. Lauren Breen. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me.
First of all, how did you get involved in the study of thanatology?
Well, I guess I was looking for a topic to do my PhD. I didn't really know what to do it on, but I really wanted to do a PhD. I knew that, and not just so people could call me doctor. But yeah, I was thinking, well, what questions have I been thinking about, and what would I find interesting to motivate me over several years of trying to answer this question? And a few years before that, maybe about 2 years before, a family member had died in a road traffic crash. And yeah, so seeing the impact that that had on people in the family, seeing the impact of, I guess, social networks and friends, some who were amazing to the people who really needed the support, and some who maybe disappeared a little bit, or didn't maybe come forward in the way that you might have expected. There was also a court case. There were all these things going on, and I went to the literature to make sense of it, thinking, well, I'd already done undergraduate psychology. There must be lots of stuff that I can learn in the literature to help me understand this. And there was some stuff, but also not a lot of stuff there that I felt was really resonating with me. And I think just in the naivety of youth, thought, well, I can do that. I'll dedicate my PhD to that. So I ended up doing my PhD on people who've had a family member die in a road traffic crash in Western Australia. And then from then have done lots of other projects, whether it's to do with end of life and palliative care and grief across the lifespan. So what is it like for children or teenagers or young people, and adults of all ages? And yeah, lots of different kinds of things.
And did having that community psychology background, did that help with the research, or was there almost like an attachment? Was that a potential complication, given this is more of a research and longitudinal study?
I think the community psychology component, what I really like about that is it's very values driven, and it's about um, um, valuing diversity. It's about working with people. So trying to do some research projects. So some of the more recent ones I've been doing have been much more collaborative, working with young people, for example, as co-researchers, as opposed to, me expert, you research subject, ways of thinking about things or doing things. Yeah, and looking also, community psychology is about not ignoring negative things, but it's also about, well, can we find some, just gone blank, sorry. um, I guess, can we find some uh, yeah, sorry. 1 second. Let me just look up something.
No, perfectly fine.
We'll just edit that little bit out.
Yes, I made note of the time. It's all okay.
And I guess it's also about looking at things from a strengths-based perspective, um, those kinds of things too. So not just what's bad about people or what's bad about their situation, but what's good about their situation. How can we identify those strengths? How can we build upon those as well?
You mentioned they're working alongside young people, and I'd be interested if you could tell me kind of what's the influence of age, of culture, of spirituality in someone going through a bereavement.
Yeah, that's a really, really big question. So I think I'll try and answer it without taking hours. Um, it's when we think of grief, often we think about it as a single emotion, which it's not. It's multiple emotions, but it's also much more than just emotions. It does impact us and is impacted by the things that we bring to it. So whether it is our age, um, our cultural background, our spiritual beliefs, and so on. So if we think about spiritual beliefs, for example, when we experience the death of someone or any kind of crisis, our spiritual beliefs might be very comforting to us. They also, for some people, we might question those beliefs because, how could a benevolent God have done this to me or my family? And so it can take, for some people, a bit of time to unpack and to reconcile what's happened with their spiritual beliefs. And as I said, for others, those beliefs are just very comforting and the people in those communities are very supportive. So yeah, there can be a lot going on when it comes to younger people. For example, there's lots of assumptions that maybe, children are just generally resilient. We don't really need to do anything to help them anyway when they experience a loss or a crisis in their life, or um, it's such a niche thing. It doesn't really happen to young people. And actually, it happens much more commonly than what most people realize. So we think that in Australia, by the age of 18, probably, 1 in 20 young people has experienced the death of a parent. And obviously it's then even more if we count deaths of siblings or grandparents or so, every year 12 classroom, probably going back to school soon, will have, one child in that classroom who doesn't have a parent anymore because that parent has died. Um, so yeah, there's lots of those kinds of assumptions when it comes to young people. So yeah, lots of work for me and others to do in getting that information out there.
So I grew up in country WA, and there was a number of my classmates who died in road traffic accidents when I was at school. And I'm kind of pre-Instagram. Facebook was really in its infancy, but you do see a lot of commemorative posts and a lot of Facebook pages that are still maintained for people that have been bereaved. Is that a comforting? What is kind of the general feeling for young people when they see that, or anyone that you've had interactions with? Do those kind of like memorial pages still having active Instagram pages or Facebook pages, and you see posts celebrating their birthday? Are they helpful to someone who's going through a bereavement? Are they harmful? You think?
You mentioned in your introduction the idea of, the bonds that we have with people who are close to us. And it used to be thought that when someone dies, we have to disconnect from that person and break that bond. And that was an idea, going back to Sigmund Freud, that we need to do that. And that's actually not the case. What we think now is that those bonds are actually really important, and maintaining those bonds. So what we now call continuing bonds is actually really important. So it can be that the way that we remember people, it can be, and social media can have a really important role in how we might do this, that it might pop up on a site that it's such and such's birthday, and you write something nice there and their family can still see that. Oh, isn't it lovely that it's been 12 years, but that my child's friends still think about them, and, you know, so it can absolutely be very useful. I mean, it's not necessarily always useful. One of the things that we need to be very careful of with when it comes to social media is if that's how people are finding out about the death. So, if something comes up and it's maybe in the media and they show you mentioned road traffic crashes. So maybe they show a car or they show a motorbike crash, and there's you recognize that car or that motorbike or whatever, and you realize, oh my gosh, that must be such and such. And there have been times where people have found out about the deaths of family members and friends through social media, without it being done through the proper channels and hopefully a much better way of getting that information. So as long as we're not doing that kind of thing, generally the idea about sharing memories and keeping people's memories alive and providing comfort to others is really important and can be really helpful and supportive to people.
If I could go back to your earlier point, Lauren, you mentioned the importance of spirituality and its interconnectedness with bereavement. I just wondered, is there any research into Eastern religions where they may have the idea of reincarnation or someone coming back in a different form or way? Is there more of an social acceptance around death in those people with those denominations of spirituality beliefs?
So I would probably have to say I'm not entirely sure. I would say that a lot of the research that has happened when it comes to issues of grief and loss, particularly stuff from, say, a few decades ago that informed the development of many models and theories that were in use then, were very much based on the experiences of white, middle class, middle aged women grieving the deaths of their husbands through illness. So there's still a lot to go in terms of really, in our research and in our practice, representing the full diversity of our communities. So I'm not really aware of, off the top of my head, I'm not saying it doesn't exist, but of research or information showing that there, maybe comparative studies showing how different religious beliefs or, the relevance of things like reincarnation and so on, and how they might or might not be helpful when it comes to coping with bereavement.
Is the progression through grief, loss, and bereavement, is it a linear process, or do people often backslide into other as they progress through it?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think it's really common for people to think that there are very distinct stages of grief. I hear it all the time I see it all the time in, movie previews and, which stage of grief are you in now? And oh, it just makes me so angry. There isn't a, there's no evidence of there being a very clear linear process where there are distinct stages where you move from one distinct stage into the next and into recovery. Most grieving people will say things like it's a roller coaster, or it comes in waves, or it's not like walking a staircase, or they use those kinds of ways to characterize their grief and those kinds of metaphors. And I think it's really important that we don't think about grief as being this very linear, distinct, stage-based process, because that can actually be dangerous. If grief for you comes in waves or isn't like a staircase or feels like a roller coaster, that's actually completely normal and common. But if you think, I must be going crazy because my grief isn't going in the way that it should go, and I say should in quote marks there, that it's I'm meant to be in this neat stage and then move into this neat stage, you can easily think that I must be going crazy. And you're definitely not. You're actually experiencing normal grief.
Is that experience of grief different amongst age groups?
How we experience grief or how we understand it can definitely differ. Like, obviously, young children might not understand death as a permanent state. For example, we also know that young children, say primary school age, while at all ages we can experience it in our bodies, they might be more likely to talk about having a headache or a tummy ache. Um, and yeah, there's other kinds of things. They might also be more likely to think that they caused it somehow, depending on their age, because a lot of children think that, they're the center of the universe. And I guess they are the center of their universe, but they might think that this is because something I did. I was naughty at granddad's house and now he died. It must be because I was naughty. They're also less likely to understand the codes that adults might speak in. So if I said to you, oh, I lost my friend last week, or I lost my dad last year, you don't think that I've misplaced them. You understand the code of what I'm saying, but children often don't. So I am a big advocate for actually using the D words, so death, dying, and dead, to be very clear that we don't create confusion for children around, grandma went to sleep and didn't wake up, and then now that child is very anxious about bedtime because could that happen to me now? So yeah, being very clear about using the language that we use in talking about death, dying, grief, and loss.
I think societally we have this intention to protect children from harm, and we think of bereavement as being associated with harm, or the process of grief as being harmful for the child. Is there evidence to the contrary of that? Is it better to include or recognize dying as a normal process and include children where appropriate
Mm.
into that process?
Yeah, so I definitely don't want to get into sounding like I'm being negative about parents or teachers or anyone who's involved in the care of children. Everyone is trying to do their best. And obviously, you can see why they want to protect kids from harm or from difficult and challenging topics. Absolutely, I get that too. I'm a parent myself. But yeah, we know that children tell us in our studies that they actually know so much more than what the adults around them often give them credit for. And they have so many questions, but they're often scared to ask those questions. And this goes even for bereaved children who have a lot of questions about death and about grief, but maybe they don't want to ask their caregiver because they don't want to add to that caregiver's upset and sadness. They don't want to create further, distress for mum, for example, if they ask a question about dad who died, or how dad died, or how grandma died, or whatever their question might be. And so, yeah, I think it's really important to think about these topics as topics that can be normal topics in the family or in the household, just in the same way you might talk about animals or celebrities or politics or sport or the Olympics or fashion or anything else. These kinds of things can be part of the normal family language and conversation and vocabulary. You don't have to talk about it every single day, but it can just be normal. And you can think about, maybe you're going for a walk to the park with a child and you see, I don't know, a dead cockroach on the road. And you can then talk about oh, look at that dead cockroach. That cockroach is dead. That means its body and its brain doesn't work anymore. Um, what do you think about that? Maybe its cockroach family is feeling really sad now. Yeah, maybe it does. And then you just move to the park and play on the swings, but you've had a little bit of that conversation just in normal day-to-day life.
It's almost got to be quite intentional, doesn't it? Because if a parent is not in a position in which they are emotionally available or in a position where they can discuss someone's bereavement, then unintentionally we're creating avoidance in the child, and that topic will not be discussed, and then they will then have we experience potentially greater conflict. As you said, they will experience greater conflict around how they assess bereavement in the future and how they will respond to that. I wanted to ask, what advice could you provide for someone who's potentially facing their own mortality?
Well, I don't really want to give advice for how people should or shouldn't be, um, what they should or shouldn't be thinking or doing. But maybe having a discussion with people close to them about what it is that they want, what what kind of death that they might like to have, what kind of funeral they might like to have, how they might like to be remembered. I think it's important for all of us to try and have our own wishes met. And it can be helpful, I think, to have that discussion as hard as it can be, because then people who are trying to plan those things have an idea of what that person wanted. For example, for their funeral, what songs did they want? all kinds of things. Who was going to get various, possessions? And we mentioned before about continuing bonds, and those possessions, those things that we might pass on from one generation to the next, for example, can be really important ways of having, maintaining those bonds with people over time.
Dr. Lauren Breen recently spoke at a TED Talk, and one of the things he said that was of particular interest to me is he mentioned that we need to accept that there might be this idea that we won't experience closure with the passing, with the bereavement of someone. I wonder if you can tell me a little bit more about that.
Yeah, again, closure is one of those things that you hear on TV all the time, or you see that, people need closure. And it used to be that I guess people thought about grief as having a distinct endpoint, and now we don't. It's just part of life. We are the culmination of all the good and bad things and all the gains and losses that we've had in our life. And so I tend to think about words like closure and letting go and moving on and recovery is kind of being banned from my vocabulary when I'm talking about grief. If a grieving person says that they found it something helpful for them in order to help them move on, great. I'm certainly never going to correct them in quote marks and say, you're grieving wrong. That would not be helpful. But yeah, I don't want people to feel like that they have to let go and move on and recover and achieve closure. It's totally fine that it could be many, many years and you still, you look at a photo of someone or you have a memory of them or some music comes on that reminds you of them and you smile or you have a little tear or whatever it is. And that's perfectly fine and normal to still have that connection to that really important person who was in your life.
Dr. Lauren Breen, thank you so much for your time. It's been a
Thank you
great
so
discussion.
much.
Stop recording now.
So sorry for the complete brain problem.
No, not at all.
So embarrassing.
It's okay. It's why we